Hello everyone, today we talk about Piasts Poland, in particular reference to the general structural weakness of the political institutional system, and not, however, denying or wanting to overlook what the achievements of the Polish monarchy were, especially in the period before the last decades of the 11th century, in a sense even afterwards, as we will see today, because of still the intertwinement that the various Polish duchies after the Piast repartitions actually maintained with one another. And this is, in fact, a video I should have made after another one that looks at properly what was going on in this broader Central European area between Germany, Poland, Bohemia, in the definition of properly this broader political and military spaces, still in a moment, to say, by the end of the 10th, the beginning of the 11th century, where Christianity, and Western Christianity especially, was being defined in the area where these countries came to fall into a broader, in fact, interconnection that was the one of the Roman Church, even properly of the Western Empire per se, even though Poland, as you know, wasn't part of that, but you know that there was an important cooperation and presence also of the Germans in the process of Christianization through the same. Think about St. Adalbert, that was effectively a Bohemian, and that had his destinies connected to Poland, the relics of which, stolen by the Pomeranians, were eventually ransomed by Boleslav of Poland. And so this definition also of the spaces, right, of the political territorial dominations in the area, and so that's why, let's say, this instability that characterized 12th and 13th century Poland before the last Piasts would give kind of a broader solidity, and eventually there were also the Angevins at some point, but the Jagiellonians later on created something even more based, as you know, in terms of interconnections. Think about Lithuania, etc. That's another thing that we will look at in another moment. And yet, it's important, still speaking of Eastern connections, of the relations that existed between the Piasts and the Rurikids of the Kyivan Rus, and the important support that they gave each other in some instances. Think about even the Polish intervention in the Kyivan dynastic struggles at some point. The fact, indeed, that there wasn't much of a boundary between the two countries. Recently, we talked a lot about Polish, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian history in the modern and contemporary era. So these are connections actually that date back to a long time before. The Poles already by this time had extended some control on Alich, on parts of the Russian Palatinate, and albeit those weren't stable too. So it was an important moment of definition of order in an area, and this is also what makes the whole thing bright, is that had never had such monarchic style orientation before, historically. Right, for us, let's say, in a narrowly Western sense, we give for granted of the fact that there were things like, contact with more advanced civilizations from millennia. There had been a Roman state. There was an ecclesiastical organization. There was a broader interconnection between the various states on this base of ecumenic goals. And beyond even the boundaries of the same state, like it would have been the case in the Byzantine Empire, in Central Eastern Europe, things were very different, right? And in Northern Europe as well. I mean, there had properly some civilization was being born, was being made just at that point, practically, and so the Piasts' effort was extraordinary, because after all, the Polands, this these tribes that had managed to assert their domination in more or less the center of the modern Poland geographically today, managed to consolidate to give birth and consolidate to a real country, to a real, what would become a national identity, an important culture in Central Europe, in the Western world, like Poland. And so it's very important to look at this seminal moment. And I promise we will make more videos talking about this, and also the broader connections of Poland with also the West that are also a great part of the reason. I mean, the Metus Hostilis also here played a very important role, and namely in the form of the Germans, right? The Ottonians that always interfered. Also the let's say the attrition with Bohemia. You know that at some point there was an attempt to dominate on it from the Polish side, and there is a feature that we have observed. We'll look better at now in a sense. In those videos I made, there's a playlist named Medieval Slavs in Eastern Europe, right, that contains this cauldron of different realities from Central, Southern, Eastern Europe, and there is a type of video that I used to do in the past and probably come back at some point, that is a general comparison, especially of, I think the most meaningful one is between Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary, right? But it can be extended to other East and South if you want. And that share some characteristics, such as that we observe mostly in these centuries, in part in the High Middle Ages, but especially in the Late Middle Ages, when there is an important dynamic, an important shift, because you see, these countries had been born effectively from a non-feudal reality, as we will see better. Latin Germanic Europe was all framed, was being completely framed, even in Germanic fringes that had remained out of this, in a feudal glue that, albeit very intricate and apparently, unruly, etc., was actually quite solidifying, right? The Western Europe saw this greater statal administrative development earlier, in spite of feudalism, you could say. Feudalism had been possible also because there had been the resources to concentrate in fewer hands and still to invest in other areas and expanding. Central and Eastern Europe historically didn't have this, right? They were more distant from civilization, they were colder, they were more sparsely populated, they had less communications in general. They didn't have cities historically, they had fortified hill forts, like there had been the Iron Age before, and great part of especially the Slavic political consolidation had started from a relatively recent time, actually on the wake of what we could call the migration era, that arguably up to not very few before these times had ended in those areas, whereas in the West had been over from a longer time, and this aspect had been very important for the definition of these spaces, because again there were a lot of pre-existing populations that contributed to this, but let's say there is evidently that this is, especially in the case of Poland, if you study also the mythology of the foundation of the eagle, it's always the same Indo-European mythological base that you find all over Europe, that had properly come in arms to create a domination, right? It was a markedly military nature of these peoples that therefore had also broader imperial ambitions, hence the relevance of what we were saying before in terms of what also Poland presented itself to be in comparison to the empire, right? The Polish kings at some point, stressed that, the German emperors had to obey the Pope while they were free, ideally. Well, eventually Poland would become very much in line with the Catholic Church, but in general, right, there is a more like a kind of a tribal clanic mentality within Slavic countries at this point in the High Middle Ages than there is in the West. That is fundamentally becoming a dynastic feudal reality, right? This is very evident. I had the fortune of studying still a late 13th century context where I could look a bit between Germany, Bohemia, and Poland, and I noticed this properly in the sources of how they addressed each other, right? Bohemians and Poles would talk about the common ancestry of the stocks of things. The Germans at the time were all about the Romanity of the empire, of the dynasty of kings, and all these things. It was a completely different thing. Not that, I mean, the Slavs didn't care about dynastic lines, but these were emerging just now in the High Middle Ages, more like in fact, on the imitation of Western models, right, the Frankish influence, etc., that of course the elites were the first ones to buy, but that originally were much kind of more, egalitarian minded. Reason for which, however, this extended in a sense to a great part, at least to the freemen in general, that again weren't faring better than in the West. We know even in the development of agriculture, etc. But politically speaking, this means that there were not powerful enough elites to control the whole system. So what emerges in Poland with the Piasts, in Bohemia with the Przemyslids, etc., is of course an attempt to bring under control people on a territory that before had kind of moved and waged this remarkable conquest, etc., but had never been based on a state, right? So what we're looking at now, is properly the attempts to define this. Also because the more these peoples got sedentarized from a semi-nomadic is a big word, right? Semi-nomadic can be even something of short range, right? It doesn't have to be coming from the steppe, right? It means that, again, the settlements can be unstable for whichever reason, wars, famines, things like these. And these were the cases, like the grounds were terrifying in a sense. And thus, by sedentarization, and especially the lack of that central authority, the elites would gain weight. Empowered would gradually bring the peasantry under. And as we've seen in the late medieval history videos, this would bring on the longer run, in the absence of a pre-existing statal reality, like for the monarchy, these monarchies to essentially lose the clash against the nobility and to become elective in nature, which means that the nobility very often also began to call foreign dynasts that didn't have pre-existing connections with the land, etc. Whereas the Piasts, and especially the Przemyslids, had, this is true also for the, the Arpads in Hungary, this is a comparable history, had made a relentless effort to centralize in a way or another, especially through cities, by integrating, especially the Jewry. This is very true in Poland, especially. In these hill forts that would gradually become cities and could kind of side with the king against the nobility in a way. And therefore, given that these countries didn't have quite robust middle classes like in the West would instead develop, the general weight would shift towards the oligarchies, and the same reason why these dynasties, these monarchies in a way or another, in modern times would have been either conquered by somebody else, or this would suffer a foreign domination of some sort, right? Different degrees, because they hadn't managed to compact in a statal-like fashion, like it said from the late Middle Ages was happening successfully in the West with a completely different model, when the monarch was really managing to curb the nobility. So this one of these one of the features of this dynamic is that in Central Europe, this encompassed also certain parts of Germany, and most of these aforementioned monarchies, there was a big deal of supranational, let's say, dynastic cooperation or interaction in the same way. That is to say, if the nobility is hostile, what I can do is looking at a neighboring country, monarchy, and allying with the local royal dynasty, so that we can't fight against, say, the local nobility is going to be tending to be more locally interested than the dynasts, so we can try to counterbalance the fact that they're less eager, or they have also less means often to cooperate with the foreign nobilities at the detriment of the monarch, and so which would still happen, by the way. Nevertheless, and trying to sum up also dynasty in literally with biological fusions, because at that point, if you marry into royalty, eventually you can inherit maybe the two kingdoms as a sole heir, and this would happen, right? And this is typical, especially of late medieval Central European history, right? Between Hungary, Poland, Bohemia, Austria, this was done all the freaking time, right? And the objective was exactly that one, right? In a situation where already the electoral turn had taken properly over the country, that there could be, or at least, not if not over, still had severely undermined the possibility of further centralization by that point, especially in times still of great threat, right, for the stability, because of wars and other things. And so this thing paradoxically started very early on, right? Sometimes we overlook that. So first of all, the Polish state had been recognized historically like a duchy, right? Meaning that it was properly military in nature. It's been recognized by the Germans, by the emperors. So internationally speaking, Poland was pretty kind of warlike thing that, stressed the fact that they weren't even properly framed within a kingdom yet. They were mostly like, they were leaders of men, of military clienteles that had established this domination. First of all, consider this, that Poland was big, right? For medieval standards, it was a hell, like, territorially speaking, right? It was quite composite, because we're still some peoples within the boundaries that do not correspond to the modern country, as you know, but not even kind of like the contemporary country, but not even to the modern one, as you know. There were shifts in that. But it was still really large, right? It was difficult terrain. There were forests, marshes, rivers, etc. Warlike people in general inhabited them. So it was very difficult to control unitarily, right? And this was one of the reasons, specific reasons of its own weakness, just as a territorial domination. And if, in fact, in 1076, the Piasts assumed the royal title, properly of kings of Poland, to better underline their organic political independence, especially from the Holy Roman Empire, which was successful in the case of Poland. And probably the Germans could have not really done anything against. Even Bohemia was difficult actually to control, because if it was difficult to control, by the way, by the local kings, you can imagine what it was by foreign ones, right? So there was a degree, of course, of compenetration. There was a sort of Germanic sphere of influence at some point that the Polish kings did recognize the Holy Roman Emperors, etc. It was an international game. Importantly enough, the Poles were framed, like the Bohemians, within the Western Christendom, right? As much as Hungary, there had been Orthodoxes had arrived up there, but they didn't make it over to Catholics. And this was still kind of, by the way, borderline Christian reality, right? Just like in Scandinavia, right? The elites would convert for obvious the obvious advantage that it brought, where the rest of the people was still pretty much, there were, as you know, pagans. We didn't think about the Prussians, etc., even the Pomeranians. There was still a lot to do in that sense. Again, the Christianization entailed a stable infrastructural administration, which is a big deal for a state, right? And so this had yet all to be built, and gradually was starting at this point. So the royal title was very relevant to say we're not just like a group of military leaders anymore. We are an actual country, we're an actual state, we're an actual kingdom. There is a sacred nature in our own domination, in our own rule, and this is to be internationally preserved in the name of the Catholic Church and the cooperation between Christian people. And yet this, however, could not spare Poland from during the 12th century, especially from the 30s onwards, that to the development of the aristocratic power, that in the 12th century was really strong all over Europe with the broader economical and demographic revival, would be present within the royal family of the Piasts a succession system that was actually identical to the one of the Kyivan Principality. That, as you know, was a pretty interesting one, because in theory the Kyivan princes, the Rusian princes, were all claiming at least to descend from this adventurer Rurik. Was essentially a Viking. He had been fighting against the Franks, then had gone in the Baltic when things were going wrong, and he had started in Varangian times this line, right, marrying into the local Slavic elites, because at the end of the day the Kyivan Rus was not much of a Viking, but an actually local Slavic development. And that, however, retained this dynastic idea, which is typical, especially of in these areas where there is no such thing like a formal kind of properly juridical room for a single ruler, right, by tradition, because it's mostly a tribal reality. That would confer some sort of, charisma, authority, and legitimacy to the local rule, because the idea is that the strongest rules, so these Viking mercenaries that had come and comforted the political and military action of the local Slavic leaders, they had married into their families, etc., and had therefore become part of the whole system, were seen as the princely elite managing to claim some kind of overall interconnection between the various principalities. As you know, the Rus was enormous, right? It encompassed lands, territories, and communities that had barely anything to do with each other. They were, broadly speaking, Eastern Slavic, but they were quite frontier lines, even with other peoples, etc. Kiev had been the most, by far, the most powerful of these principalities, was the most important political, economical center. It objectively did have an enormous weight, and especially acquired even in there with Christianization, with the Constantinopolitan connection, was just the military power. The fact that they defeated the Khazars, they managed to maintain properly the grandeur of their own domination. And so the idea was that the Rurikid bloodline had lived within all the people who, all the princes of the Rus, and that this would confer them also some kind of legitimization. In the case they would have wanted to assume the control of the same Kiev that was seen as the golden apple, and so the most powerful of the Rusians had the right to rule over Kiev. And so this thing happened in Poland in the same way. And how? So all the males of the Piast family inherited the political power. So this was essentially what had been present also among the Germanic peoples up to the spread of the vassalic beneficiary system, was the idea that every son inherited the same amount of their father's possessions, which consequently meant that more or less contiguous territorial domination would have been split mercilessly at every generation, and thus creating further conditions of instability, because all these sons wanted to achieve the recompaction of power. And this was based, as we were saying before, in a tribal clanic fashion and a kind of a egalitarian principle, right? Everybody's alike. There is no such a thing like a special guy who becomes the king of all. We are all free in theory, which of course in terms of the rest of the people didn't actually count, because the rest of the people were considered as nothing, also because these were kind of military leaders, so whoever worked for them was, there was nothing egalitarian about that. And especially in these lands historically, the condition of the peasants would be something nightmarish in the first place. But there was at least the moral recognition that seniority, so the elderly son, was at least the guy who had to maintain a sort of preeminence, right? In a purely formal sense, because again, power, land, people went in the hands of the various sons. So that principle of seniority was somewhat just nominal in many ways. And the rivalries among the Piasts, among the same Piast brothers, in order to consolidate their own seigniories and to achieve the seniorate over the other brothers, was connected to the control of Krakow, right? As in the Kyivan Rus, it was in fact Kyiv. In Poland, it was Krakow. Krakow was in fact historically the first Polish capital. We can use this term by high medieval times, especially. That was, as you know, in the south of Poland, it was kind of closer to, in fact, to civilization in general. It was one of the few really important centers that the control of which was necessary to claim some sort of, superiority, because of course it was not just, you don't control cities just like that. In the cities there are people, and there are often the more developed people, and that's exactly what, generally speaking, these countries lacked. So holding such big centers like Kiev or Krakow meant that you really had the political and social support of the communities broadly met, and this was naturally contested all the time by especially the nobility, at some points even by the church, because the relations were strained. There was some attempt there, as the lay noblemen were gaining power, also the church was gaining in power. So at some point, I don't know, there were some Polish bishops that were killed by Polish kings. But I mean, these things happen. I don't know, think about Thomas Becket in the same century, by the way, in England. So there were similar dynamics, right? Because this was the struggle for really maintaining a unitary power, which in these conditions was very, very hard to maintain, right? In another country, there would have been kind of already historically by the accumulation of land assets and estates, some contiguous territorial lordships well endowed with a lot of land, with a lot of people, in the hands of fewer princes, right? Pick I don't know, the Ile-de-France for the Western Frankish kingdom and the Capetian monarchy. Other systems were present, just in countries that could afford a broader coordination, some kind of greater concentration of wealth. In these countries, it was like the worst, of course, there were landed assets, seigniories, etc., but they were much more scattered, much more provisory, right? Much more recent in a way. So stabilizing on their base was really complicated. And there was naturally throughout all this time, as we were saying before, in fact, an interaction with the neighboring powers, right? That could mean sometimes even an intervention, meaning either intervening in their own land, or sometimes even suffering invasions sometimes. So we're talking, generally speaking, here about the east-west axis. Could be the Kievan princes, the German emperors, and these very complicated stories, by the way. At some point I hope to go in detail. This is just kind of general videos, but this pushed in a general sense to, by the end of the 12th century, to substitute this kind of traditional system of equal inheritance with an actual dynastic one, right, of the crown and of Krakow in a single line of the Piasts family. Naturally, this was not respected at all, but politically, institutionally, it was recognized at least as the thing that had to be. That is to say, whoever, because up to that point there had been uncertainties about that, even about probably the existence of the kingdom, because naturally the nobility said, wait, who are you to claim this superiority, this primacy, this dominance over everybody? We were traditionally free, and we would state that. Instead, the thing would structure hierarchically, also because of the same dynamic happening in parallel to a lesser scale within the same nobility, right? And lesser scale, especially in this context compared to the monarchy, is relative. And therefore it was accepted, just even for the sake of the stability of the country, that, by the way, was entering kind of broader international relations, and with also dangerous enemies, especially the German Ostsiedlung was quite, as you know, taking interesting turns towards Poland, etc. It was important to say, okay, there should be a head, there should be kind of a center like Krakow, and what is important at this point is that we recognize each other as members of the Piast dynasty, which in fact would be continued in the following centuries as essentially the blood criterion to say, okay, who is to rule in the first place. They would marry among each other, so without the rest of the nobility, to preserve this this unity from an ideological point of view. What was not possible to achieve in other ways was also reinforced by claiming a bloodline, right, which was very important, as we've seen. The Kyivan Rus had done exactly the same. And so also the partitions of Poland, which sounds bad considering what happened in the late modern age, but literally by the same Piasts at each generation to say who's what, right? And so would take some form in the history of Poland, because there were some provincial areas properly that would take a political and kind of even cultural connotation on that base that was becoming ever more feudal in nature. So with these lordships within the kingdom, headed by the Piasts, and naturally the broader cohesion was loose, right? There are interesting divides that you can see in the geographical extremities of the country. For example, I made a video back in the day. There's a Polish warfare playlist. We talk about Polish warfare, Polish army, exactly between the 11th and the 13th century. As we've seen, as by the end of the period, like a northwestern Polish knight was essentially an identical copy of a German one, whereas a southeastern one was something much closer to a Russian, with much more also steppes influences, etc. Polish cavalry had been really important since the origin, right? By, I don't know, the 11th century, they didn't have that ultra heavy feudal cavalry that would develop in the centuries, but they had a lot of cavalry in the first place. Like 1/3 of the Polish armies was mounted, which is a lot, right? In the rest of Europe, you don't find quite the same proportion. That tells you also how importantly influenced were by steppes warfare at that point, by the migration era. The same goes for the Russians at that point. Then, of course, with this, political institutional definition, the spread of feudalism, etc., the Poles become ever more westernized in warfare. By the end of the Middle Ages, basically there is no difference anymore with Western armies, except in the late modern age, given that they took control of much more eastern lands. Again, they kind of re-steppicized, as you know. Even the famous Polish hussars were somewhat a recreation of those times. They were not traditional in medieval times. They were reinvented during the modern one. But surely an important equestrian tradition had always existed. Naturally, there were military expeditions here. We're seeing another time, but I don't know, against Pomerania, the Poles arrived even as lords, and sometimes as properly within the boundaries of the German kingdom. up to Rügen. At some points they had this trouble. They managed to secure that area, whereas in the northeast they had troubles with the Prussians, even with the Lithuanians at some point. I mean, before becoming best friends, let's say, very cynically, when the Teutons managed to wipe, threatened to wipe Lithuania away, and actually destroying it at some point. So much that that's where the alliance with Poland arrived. The Lithuanians used to raid into Polish territory as pagans also. That the Polish kings were the ones that settled the Teutonic Knights in Prussia as vassals, in fact, formally of the Polish kingdom, etc. So we're looking, in fact, also immediately at a terrestrial power. Poland didn't have much of a, maritime validity. It was mostly the Teutonic lands recovered at the end of the Middle Ages that had opened to the Baltic, to the Hanse, etc. Think about Danzig, or this, in fact, properly German cities they had developed. In any case, what was sanctioned both by the Polish aristocracy and the episcopate, and both by the papacy and the empire, in the dynastic royal recognition of the Piasts and this succession mechanism, did not put an end to the fractioning of the kingdom internally in autonomous principalities that, as we were saying before, were often enemies among each other, in the hands of the various Piast lines that were forming, meanwhile, a kind of parallel, in fact, branches of the same family, all married into each other, and with bloodlines that, however, surpassed the Polish boundaries, given that they were married also into the princes of Kiev. That sees the greater connection, let's say. Naturally, this eastern connection would be wiped out by the Mongols. That changed a big deal. And much more than we think, generally speaking, because the Mongols made of Russia great part of what it became eventually, in a ferociously autocratic and militaristic, imperialistic sense, whereas the Kyivan Rus and essentially was kind of much more of a Western thing back in the day than it would become. Those lands would become later under Mongol vassalage, and it was in a sense it's maybe not an alternative per se, but it was just a different model from Western feudalism per se, and it was shared with Poland, interestingly enough. So as we've seen, this system had its own weakness in a way. The Mongol invasion did not succeed in the Rus just because the Mongols were superheroes that defeated everybody and anything. Like in war, always things are, you have to be understood politically and socially. The Kyivan Rus on the wake of the Mongol invasion was displaying those problems, because fundamentally the princes were consolidating in this immense space that didn't quite was increasingly losing cohesion in a more territorial sense. The middle classes had managed to maintain some prerogatives against the princes, but they also were kind of declining. It was a process of stagnation. So that thing probably would have not gone so far, as quick as and ponderous as the first expansion had been, after all, because the Kyivan Rus was really a power to be reckoned with. So in a way, if we look at this broader Central European space between the 12th and the 13th century, up to the beginning of the 13th especially, it was an immense Christianized Slavic space that was, however, divided largely in a multitude of principalities, factually, because the Rus was like that, Poland was like that, grouped, in fact, around Krakow or Kyiv for political hereditary, and respectively also in Gniezno that was subordinated to Rome, and to Kiev subordinated to Constantinople for what concerned the ecclesiastical coordination and religious right. So it's really important to see these different directions that the regions would take on a religious base, because naturally there were simply also different forms of acculturation springs, right? Constantinople was exporting probably a certain view of power, of autocracy, even there surely affected the same Rus, but also was kind of less influent in terms of properly of political reach, etc. Rome was very different. Rome was at that point consolidating an immense power and influence on all the Western Christendom. Gniezno was the let's say the spiritual capital of Poland. That was the relics of Saint Albert had been brought after they had been won back from the pagan Prussians, and just the model of ecclesiastical organization was different, much more capillary in a way too than the Orthodox one. So that was a big divide for sure. Gradually, what is crucial also is the German influence, because of all these immense space, you could pick the entire Central Europe and entire Eastern Europe. Central Europe definitely was more advanced and was definitely becoming. Sometimes you read, comparing the Kyivan Rus said the most acculturated place in Europe at the time, the most advanced. Well, quite not, right? It was just very prosperous and powerful in this first wave, and for centuries indeed. But it mostly revolved around the main Russian rivers that Saint Kyiv embodied, given its fantastic position, and it had accumulated a lot of wealth, there is no doubt. But at the end of the day, this system, Mongols or not, doesn't seem to have reached actually the same, properly the same achievements of the Western world, and this is interesting to watch, because naturally we may think, well, but the Mongol invasion took away a lot, right? We've seen that there was also a proof, of course, that the Russian land, especially the one of Kiev, also the Russian Palatinate, that incidentally was becoming the most acculturated place, also because it was the westernmost in a way, civilized the Lithuanians that came to rule those places. They had an important weight. But let's say Poland in itself, just by comparison, was already kind of a more structured country by that point, paradoxically, than the Rus. Also, in this, the German influence played a great role, because, again, Poland is a big part of Central Europe, but in the westernmost part of Central Europe, you have not just Germany, but you have Bohemia. And Bohemia, this all was a Slavic kingdom, but it was part of the Germanic Empire, and as such, it was actually a much more orderly, compact, and in fact westernized country than Poland, right? It was smaller, definitely, but the internal cohesion that the Przemyslids managed to achieve, especially by the 13th century, was like Bohemia was one of the most advanced places in Central Europe by that time, especially after during the Great Interregnum. Bohemia was the most powerful of the imperial dominations, more than anything that existed in Germany at that point. So that's quite interesting, because that's the only orderly system, and whereas this kind of more principality divided one that Poland and the Rus shared in similarities was definitely more unstable. And paradoxically, the Polish one kind of kept consolidating along the Western model, was present in Germany, in Bohemia. and it went on like an entity, even taking over parts of those lands that had belonged to the Rus, as we've seen in the modern history videos, by the way. So this also doesn't count in general the Balkan Peninsula, that was kind of a different thing. Like, in part, yes, it was split in principalities. It depends on what we're talking about. Naturally, it was still the Byzantine Empire, at least by the beginning of the 13th century. As you know, it crumbled too. So that's mainly the main moment in which there is an increase, a fragmentation in principalities as well there. So the game changed. But we're talking about another period that follows there. So it's important again to visualize these differences and drawing the conclusions as well, right? Because these, like what we have described, are both causes and consequences at the same time. As we were saying before, these lands were wild, right? They quite gradually compacted. And in fact, Poland, in this sense, considering the starting condition, achieved a big deal. Whereas the eastern you go, and the least you see that, right? And that's, again, the western you go, the more you see that instead. So that, in my opinion, as an historical interpretation, is quite meaningful if you really get what we're talking about. But we will talk better about these things in the future, hopefully. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, thank you heartily for listening to me. See you next time. Bye.